I mean, you can ask more about it, but I'm going to focus on the main thing that I understand I was going to talk about, which is the slightly or very tortuous topic of how we're going to save ourselves. So here goes. So I'm in a sort of gallows humor English sort of mode of speaking at the moment for some reason. So you have to forgive me. All right. So in the first heading for Extinction talk, there was, which I did. It's actually on YouTube. You can look it up. It's a very rambly, very unprofessional talk because that's my style. But there's several elements on it that sort of got taken out by well-meaning urban liberal lefty lecturer types. No disrespect to any of you that are of that demographic. So the unpleasant bits got taken out, but also the sort of psychology got taken out. And I think the unpleasant bits got taken out because there's this idea you can't upset people, which is empirically illiterate in my view. And secondly, the psychology is taken out because people think people can't really understand complicated psychology, which I think is very patronizing, because once people become concerned about something, they're perfectly capable of understanding complicated ideas. So the complicated idea is as follows, and once I've explained it to you, you'll agree that it's actually not that complicated. But the complicated idea goes as follows, which is there's a psychological theory that goes, if you tell people bad news and if you tell them that terrible things are going to happen, they get depressed and they stop organizing and they stop getting involved in things, and therefore it's bad, and therefore you shouldn't tell people the truth. So the proposition in the first heading for Extinction talk was, like most things, it's partially true, but not wholly true. So what's wholly true, arguably, is that two things happen when you tell people the truth, that something terrible is going to happen and they need to jump to it, as it were. The first thing that happens is, as the original psychological theory predicts, is most people go, oh my God, that's terrible. You know, I don't want to know. And they go out of the meeting and they become even more repressed and sort of subliminally depressed, and they don't want to turn up to actions. And you've probably seen this dynamic happen, right? But at the same time, like a minority of the audience will go, oh my God, or something more visceral than that. This is terrible. I can't live with myself and allow this to happen. I have to step up and act. And in other words, they radicalize. So to summarize, what actually empirically happens is a polarization. And that's what happens generally in society when terrible things are about to happen. You get polarizations. Most people stick their head in the sand, as we're all well aware. But a minority of people step up for a variety of reasons, I should add, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. So when you get the sort of mother of all horrible things coming down the line, it shouldn't surprise you that you get an extreme polarization, right? i.e. the world's going to be destroyed in the next generation. So a lot of people are just going to completely switch off, not even want to approach the subject. And other people are going to go, you know, tell me what to do, whatever it takes, right? So there's an interesting sort of take on this, which is that in 2018, when Extinction Rebellion set up, there was a massive upsurgence of activism, right, around the world. And I think the reason for that in retrospect was because, oh my God, maybe we can do something about it, right? So all those semi-repressed people suddenly went from semi-repressed through to pretty active, right? Which is why you had 200 people in the room. So the reason you had 200 people in the room was because there was 200 people in the room. In other words, it was self-reinforcing. And then, of course, you know, around the world, great things happen. COVID hit and various other things. And now, as you probably, you know, the subliminal agenda of this meeting is, how the hell do we mobilize people in Portland, right? Because no one's interested. So the theory goes that once the party's over, all you've got left with is you still haven't made any progress, and nothing's happening. And that's so painful that people go, I don't even want to do any activism because it's too painful. And they go and stick their heads in the sand even more strongly than before, right? And at the same time, a minority of people, which is you on the call, arguably, go, this is even worse. You know, we've got 2 years less. And they go even more sort of polarized into high-level activism, as you might say, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I think that's broadly what's happening. And I'm not, you know, there's no happy ending necessarily here, right? If you want someone with a happy ending, don't ask me to talk to you. Life doesn't necessarily have happy endings, as we should all know. But I think we can learn from episodes in the history of people that have changed the world to understand how we can step into a situation where we can maximize the probability that we do save ourselves in time, right? And I just want to give you a little bit of historical analogy, which I think is very inspiring in a way, which is the Freedom Riders in 1961. So obviously I'm a little bit endlessly nervous talking to Americans about their history because they might accuse me of being some subliminal cultural imperialist or something. But
our history is not taught in America.
Well, that's even worse in a way, isn't it?
Thank you for saying that, Daniel. That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah, well, it's just non-violence nerds like myself that sort of read this stuff. But yeah, I just have to put that little disclaimer in case, you know, how it is talking in the American public sphere is always slightly scary. Okay, so let's just have a little look at the dynamics there. So here's a sort of somewhat simplistic narrative, which you'll see is fairly similar in many ways to the structural development of Extinction Rebellion. So apologies if you already know the story, but the general gist was nothing was happening substantially or even unsubstantially really on Black rights from the American Civil War right through to 1958. So the first thing to say, of course, is sometimes it takes quite a long time to change history. So if you're getting a little bit impatient after 2 years, then, you know, think what it was like for Black agitators in the 1930s or whatever. Anyway, the upshot of it is out of the blue, the Montgomery Bus Boycott happened. And as I'm sure you probably know, like it was amazing, right? It's 20,000 Black people and they were, you know, boycotting the buses. And all the non-violence nerds that studied Gandhi in New York sort of were coming down going, oh my God, this is amazing, this is amazing. And it was amazing. And Martin Luther King was doing his stuff and they won. And there was this massive explosion of enthusiasm for civil disobedience and a mechanism that could, you know, desegregate America and blah, blah, blah. So in many ways, it's very similar to the 2019, you know, the rebellion in the UK. And then afterwards, it all sort of slightly fell apart because it was a bit like, let's do it again. So they did it again in this place called Albany that no one really remembers. And it didn't work. It's sort of, you know, like loads of people arrested, but it didn't work. And then it all sort of fell apart a bit and there was a sort of loss of nerve and they all started arguing about money and organization. Sounds sort of familiar, doesn't it? Right? And they're all bitching about each other and blah, 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 you know, human nature. And it was all a bit of a mess, right? And by 1961, which was 3 years, it was just like everyone's going, well, you know, maybe nothing's ever going to change. Because one of the things people don't realize, you know, in this in the sanitized history of the civil rights movement, it's like Martin Luther King came around and he just glided through a whole bunch of non-violence episodes, and you know, by 1967 everything was sorted. That's total bollocks, of course. Like in 1960, like everyone was going, forget this non-violence, it's rubbish, it doesn't work. We're never going to do anything with, you know, with desegregation. You know, it's like completely embedded. It'd been there for bloody 97 years or whatever. So, you know, there was a massive loss of confidence. And of course, the Ku Klux Klan was, you know, doubled in size, and everyone was saying non-violence just polarizes and upsets people, and we should go back and accommodate ourselves to the status quo. So it sort of sounds familiar, right, in many ways. So what happened in 1961 is all the nerds got together in New York, you know, and the people that studied Gandhi and blah, blah, blah. And they said, all right, well, we're not going to take this because we've had 97 years of segregation, and, you know, we're going to do whatever it takes, right, in order to challenge it. So what they did, as you probably know, is, you know, they went down black and white people on a bus, and they went down to Alabama, and they got beaten up, and the coach got set on fire. And then 3 days later, another bunch of people went down, and they were beaten up, and it went round the world. And suddenly the civil rights movement was back on the front pages, right? And the Kennedys were going, what the fuck, you know, get these people, you know, sort it out, because they're off, you know, talking to Khrushchev and trying to be the leaders of the free world. And it didn't look that sexy to have a load of beaten up people, you know, in America, because they just want to sit on a bus. So the upshot of it is that went on for 3 months. And at the end of the 3 months, there were 430 people doing hard labor in Parchment Prison in Mississippi, right? And it wasn't very pleasant, as you can imagine. Anyway, the upshot of it is several things happened. You know, sort of most superficially, they won. So they desegregated the buses. But the more important point was they created this massive sort of revitalization of the movement through the sacrifice and absolute determination to do whatever it takes, right? And so there was about 1,000 copycat sort of things happened. And after that, it was like, you know, mass civil disobedience was established as the main thing to do the deal. And that, you know, everyone remembers Selma and Birmingham, but without the Freedom Riders, Selma and Birmingham would never have happened, right? So the moral of the story is, and this is, you know, where I get a little bit nervous telling you, but you know what's coming. The moral of the story is the 20, 30, 50, 100 people in the States who get this, right? A bit like the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the core people in New York. What you have to do is to step into the truth, right? And the truth is, you know, in those days, the truth was desegregation was, you know, an absolutely intolerable transgression of human values, and destroying the next generation is a complete and absolute transgression of all human values times a million, right? So what you have to do is to step into high-level confrontation with the American state in order to throw the dice on creating enough contestation that it actually becomes credible, the method of civil resistance, as you might say. And, you know, there is an alternative theory, which is what we've been trundling along with in XRA for the last year, which is, you know, you get people along to a meeting, and then you get them to be on the side of a road, and then you get them to sit in the road, and then you get them, you know, so that's the gradual method, which has a lot going for it, right? But there's quite a lot of empirical evidence now, and I wish it wasn't true, but it's quite a lot of empirical evidence, you know, coming out of Australia and the UK and Germany, that people aren't mobilizing. And I think the reason people aren't mobilizing is because of this dynamic, right? It's like people have lost their nerve, paradoxically, at the time when they need to step up. So what's happened in Australia, just to give you a little bit of encouragement, is when I went to Australia and spent a year in Australia, and they're very much like you guys, you know, they're great guys, very dedicated, but, you know, there's a little bit of a block, let's say, on moving into high level civil disobedience. And I talked to a few of them about this. Anyway, the upshot of it is 20 of them just went, fuck it, we're going to go to Canberra and block all the roads at the opening of Parliament. So 20 people just went and did it. It wasn't particularly like agreed or anything. And 2 of those people have been to prison for a week and survived the experience, interestingly enough. And now they're little heroes, as it were, in the movement, dare I say, and they're doing like talks. And now they've got 20 people ready to go to prison, and you know, that's going to be significant potentially. And the same thing's happened in the UK, where, you know, I went to prison. I mean, I've been quite reductive here. So when I say go to prison, I don't necessarily mean just go to prison, but I'm using it as a proxy really for high level civil disobedience, right? But, you know, as you may know, in the UK, I went to prison twice and no one followed me, and it was a little bit of a downer. So, but I just tried to be very spiritual about it, you know, like all these people were going to follow me to prison, and it didn't quite happen. But but over the last 3 months, about 15 people have been to prison, because I don't know if you know, but there's about 1,000 people going through the courts at the moment in the UK. And it's an extremely, you know, annoying experience, as you may know, because you just got this judge who's, you know, waffling on and not wanting to actually deal with the climate emergency. So partially out of frustration and partially out of sort of design, people have been gluing themselves to the dock. And this was quite scary initially, because you've been put in prison for a year for contempt of court in the UK. But interestingly enough, what the courts have been doing is just putting people into prison for a week, because they don't want, you know, to martyr people, as it were. And then it's sort of caught on. So about 15 people have been to prison now. So the same thing's sort of happening like with the Freedom Riders, where people are going, okay, I'll go to prison, you know, I'll get someone to walk my dog and someone to look after my kids for a week. And, you know, and now these people are doing talks, you know, around the country, and it's catching on, because you've got all these different sorts of people now who've been to prison, and they go, it's doable, right? No one's going to come out of prison going, you know, that was the worst experience of my life. It wasn't particularly pleasant in some cases. And obviously it could be, as we all know, particularly unpleasant, but the probability is actually quite low. So even in American prison, dare I say it, but you might want to contradict me. But the upshot of it is we're potentially going to have 300 people go to prison in the autumn. So my analysis is when 300 people go to prison, that will be world news, right? In the same way as the Freedom Riders was. So I think, you know, this, I wish I could come on this call and go, more of the same, guys, you know, because I really don't like upsetting people and putting them on the spot. But, you know, what you pay me for is to, you know, tell you where the literature's at. And that's really, in my view, where it's at this stage in history. And there's variations on the theme. I'll just finish off with, yeah, I'll just say something about people who go to prison. And I think this is quite interesting. It's a bit of a tangent, but I think it might be quite comforting to some of you when you think about it. But when the Freedom Riders went to prison, right, 430 Freedom Riders went to prison, right? And just consider, by the way, that this was the worst prison in the United States. So, you know, this is why the civil rights movement won, if you want to know, right? It won because people were prepared to suffer for the cause, period. That's why it won. So, but the analysis is there were 3 types of people that went to prison. And these are very different, very different types of people. So the first group of people were like emotional, right? Like someone they'd loved had been shot or something, or had already gone to prison and they stepped up, their sister or their mother. And you see this in social movements a lot. It's like they're not particularly politically sophisticated necessarily. they're not, you know, they're not thinking God's telling them to do it. It's more like, you know, Joe, my brother's done this, I'm going to step up. And we all know that's an enormously powerful emotional thing. So it's the sort of emotional people. And then the second group were like the moral people. So that's arguably the biggest group, and, you know, probably the biggest group on this call. It's like, I cannot stand aside and live with myself and not step up, you know. And, you know, everyone on this call knows that feeling, right? That's why you're on this call, you know. Why would you want to talk to Roger Hallam on a Saturday night, you know? Could be watching Netflix, you know. Well, you're on the call because you couldn't live with yourself if you weren't stepping up. And it's a moral thing, right? You're brought up to believe you should live a moral life, and there's no way you can live a moral life if you're just sitting around waiting for this thing to happen. So, you know, that's one thing. And then the third thing is a political reason. So, you know, some of the secular people, for instance, you know, the moral people are often religious, but not necessarily. And lots of the political people are sort of secular, but not necessarily. But the political people are, you know, left-wing people, you know, saying capitalism's terrible and it's destroying the planet, or, you know, blah, 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 right? You know, there's a whole load of political reasons, as we know, of why the world's in a mess. So what I'm trying to say here is people that step up, they have different motivation structures, and I've been saying this for a while. So all those motivation structures have to be accommodated and respected, right, in order to maximize your mobilization. Okay, and the last thing I'll say, which is my standard thing, but, you know, I'll just say it anyway, which is the you know, my main, one of my intuitions about why, I mean, this sounds terrible because, you know, I love you all and everything, and you're wonderful, and I love America and blah, 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 right? But having said that, there's a problem with America, right? In my humble opinion. And it's an extremely utilitarian culture. And utilitarianism is a great moral philosophy, right? You know, I'm a business person, you know, I'm all into cost benefit analysis. But as we know, you know, the perennial sort of philosophy, you know, the perennial moral point is you can have too much of a good thing, right? And America's got too much utilitarianism. In other words, like right across the show, have you, you know, people like the title of this talk, you know, it's how do we win, right? How do we win? I mean, it's a reasonable question, right? You know, it's a moral question, but it's not the only show in town, as you probably know, if you've read the XR literature, right? There's another show in town called Virtue Ethics. And the virtue ethics orientation is, I don't care whether I'm successful, right? I don't care whether I'm successful. What I care about is whether I can look God in the eyes when I'm dead, right? And say I did my best, or some secular version of it. And the virtue ethics orientation, you know, goes back to Aristotle, and we can have a deep philosophical discussion about it. And, you know, there's pros and cons, right? I mean, the virtue ethics orientation can be really crap as well. You know, it's sort of honor codes and all that sort of stuff, right? So it's not like one's necessarily better than the other. But if you have a culture, and this is well documented, if you have a culture that's obsessed with results, then paradoxically, it destroys itself, right? Because what's the point of stepping up if there's only 5 of you on this call, right? You see what I mean? It's like, what's the point of 5 of you going to prison? It's useless. It's not going to have any effect. Correct. But the great paradox of political change is it's people that aren't bothered about changing the world who change the world. And, you know, there's complete logic to that, right? Because if everyone's looking for everyone else, then nothing's going to happen. So those original 12 freedom riders, they didn't give a flying fuck about utilitarianism, right? They were like, this is wrong, and I'm going to do it. And they were the most effective world-changing people in the 1960s, arguably, right? I mean, obviously they had a bit of luck, but you see how that works. So, you know, you can, you know, if you're very sort of clever sort of thing, you can have a philosophical little spin in your head. I think Domio does this because, you know, you're a Buddhist, aren't you, Domio? But you're quite utilitarian as well. And so am I, you know, I mean, I get up in the morning trying to work out how to change the world. But if you think about this, and I suggest you don't too much, but it just like flips around in your head, you know, you go from one to the other, and you just have to do some Zen sort of move on it, I suppose. But the upshot of it is you know, if you're seriously going to step forward to do this work, then you have to have that virtue ethics sort of awareness. You see what I mean? Because otherwise you'll burn yourself out in 6 months. And that's not to say you jettison utilitarianism, right? Obviously, you need to think about when you're going to do it and the press you're going to talk to, and and all those practicalities. No one's saying the other, but your core orientation has to be virtue ethics in terms of me predicting whether people from this call step up and do that. So I haven't sort of, I mean, I could say lots about lots of other things, but I'm saying this because I think it's the most important things I can say within half an hour to you. And there's loads of practical questions about who and when and how, and no one gets arrested in Portland and all that business. But unless you're throwing bricks or something, I don't know. But I think I think, to be brutally honest with you, it's time for 2 or 3 of you to step up and get your books together and read your Thoreau. Everyone should read Thoreau, blah blah blah, and join the great American tradition, dare I say it. I rest my case.